Hi there. Welcome to this week's episode of Deep Dive, where we take a closer look at Sunday Scripture. I am Amy, and
I guess I'm Shane. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep, absolutely.
Shane. So yesterday you had the opportunity to preach on Mark 12, 1 through 12. And I have a very important question for you as we get kicked off. Has anyone ever written a commentary about Mark 12, 1 through 12 that did not begin with some kind of sentence saying how incredibly difficult this passage is?
Yeah, I think I'd share with you earlier in the week. Yeah, everyone says that. That's just like, it's literally called the most difficult parable. And I thought you were going to say, has anyone written a commentary on it that's not enormous?
Right.
And I was going to say, not that I found.
No.
Yeah, not that I found. Yeah, everything I had researched for this sermon and read is just enormous amounts of data on this.
Yeah. So you mentioned that it was a parable. So this is the parable of the wicked tenants, it's called a lot of times.
Yes. Yeah. It's weird. I mentioned this briefly in the sermon, but we can talk about it maybe a little bit more in depth here is, I think Mark at times calls things parables that aren't parables in the strictest sense. So like, we call the parable of the sower the first parable all the way back in chapter 4, but it actually in chapter 3 says he begins speaking in parables before he actually speaking in parables. It's kind of strange.
Yes.
So parable seems to be a less defined term to Mark, or maybe as Mark, who's someone that is not, we assume not Jewish, is maybe not familiar with that as a rhetorical device.
Right. Like some kind of, like not quite as technical. Like this qualifies as a parable. This doesn't. Yeah.
And so in that case, what's interesting here is Mark says, and he began speaking to them in parables, but the only parable or even parable-like thing Jesus says at this point is this one story. So there's no plural, but Mark has it as plural. The other quibble maybe would be is this parable's weird because it seems to be much more of an analogy, a metaphor,
like an allegory.
An allegory. Than necessarily a parable, because there doesn't seem to be on its face much of a moral lesson from this, that would be required, even of an allegory. Allegory and parable are pretty similar rhetorically, but so it's challenging from that aspect. So it's the most difficult in the sense of like, what is this? But it's also most difficult because it is condemnation. There's not a lot of hope in it. So I wanted to maybe start today to talk about very briefly, I'll spend literally 1 minute on this, just about, there's a little bit of debate among scholars about this. Did Jesus actually say this, or is this something the church sort of wrote later? Because it seems to be, and everyone in the story seems to understand it as a condemnation of the Pharisees' religious establishment, and to some degree, Israel as the first receivers of God's promise. So there seems to be an element is like, did Jesus say this, or is this the church's way of making sense of it later? And then there's also debate whether there is a non-allegorical meaning to it.
Okay.
And, so or a more parable related. Is there a moral component to this? I think because the way scripture functions in the church, yes, later there certainly can be, because we can interpret scripture a lot of different ways. Just look no further than the ancient church father and known heretic, but we wouldn't call him a heretic now, Origen, who, basically understood there was no such thing as a non-allegorical reading of scripture. So, but if Jesus was the one who said this, was there a moral meaning, or was this just straight allegory? And by my estimation, it seems most scholars think, A, Jesus probably really did say this, and B, since he said it, then this is probably just pure allegory as a condemnation against this religious leadership. And so that's an interesting discussion about it. So any thoughts on that? Anything you'd run into with that?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned kind of the historical context a little bit. And I think when we're hearing Jesus in that lens of saying these things, I think that historical context is really important. You mentioned the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And I think kind of overall Mark's bent towards this kind of apocalyptic kind of future, plays into that as well. So you've got the temple that's been destroyed, and did they see that as like the sign of the condemnation that Jesus is talking about there?
Yeah. And I think another challenging aspect of this is This story, you can find other versions of it in other areas. Obviously, between Matthew and Luke have slightly different variations of the story, but beyond that, Deuteronomy has essentially, I believe it's Deuteronomy 35, has a sort of a variation. You wouldn't read it. I don't think you would naturally make a connection, but there is sort of a connection there with Deuteronomy. We obviously talked about Isaiah 5, which seems to be directly what Jesus is sort of playing with. But one of the interesting things is you may have heard about this in recent years, especially with the discovery of what is called the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt, was where we find the first sort of really full copy of what we call the Gospel of Thomas, which is this Gnostic gospel that's just a series of sayings. What's interesting is much of the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have a lot of overlap with other things, which is why one of the reasons for instance, it's not in our Bible. Plus, it wasn't widely available, which is why it took like a goat herder stepping on a clay pot in the middle of Egypt to find this thing just in the last 50 years. But once we found it, we realized, this is a Greek sort of Gnostic gospel, and there is a version of the story that is nearly identical.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so that's really interesting. Interpreters and scholars tend to think more primitive or the older interpretation or the older reading of something tends to be harsher. The language seems to be, I don't know quite how to describe it more than that without getting too much into it. But I do find that interesting. Gospel of Thomas has a very, and that's actually used as a bit of evidence why people think the Mark's reading and that really harsher reading probably came from the actual words of Jesus. So.
I think that makes a lot of sense, but I also think that is so ironic that we don't trust the Gospel of Thomas to be within the canon, but because it's in this very early text, we know it's an early text, that then it becomes evidence. It gets credence to it.
Yeah. I think so much of the way we perceive the world and the ancients perceive the world is so different, and the way their memory in particular works is a lot different than ours, and that's a real challenge. And their ethic and everything is just really complicated. But another thing I wanted to talk today about, and I didn't share any of this at all in the sermon, is there's some really unique historical rooting to this story. Like many of Jesus's stories, there are sort of implicit biases, the most famous of which is the Good Samaritan, telling a story about a Samaritan to a bunch of Jews where the Samaritan is the hero, is scandalous, which we, in a plain reading where we weren't aware of that context, wouldn't have picked up on that. This one has some elements of like this if you want to start interpreting a little further, but I think it's more Jesus just being a good communicator about a situation everyone would have understood. So in that situation would be the idea of an absentee landlord, which every Judean would have been familiar with, because this is something that we have records of going back nearly 300 years, even prior to the birth of Jesus. We have evidence in the form of letters going all the way back to the time of Ptolemies, which, we have an actual letter from dated. It's so funny. It's dated the 11th of April, 184 BC. And it's a lease between two tenants, which is just fantastic. So it's the two tenants are Angathcoles and Heracles. So, Heracles you're familiar with, but probably not the Heracles. And it basically says that the tenants will pay in the form of rent yearly at the end of the year or whenever the release of the crop is granted as grain, new, clean, and unadulterated grain, that they're supposed to pay it to the owner. And the owner is Pete Benetites. So that's a terrible pronunciation.
It really rolls off the tongue.
And it's essentially just how much they're supposed to pay him, and essentially that the owner has the right to withhold the sale of all crops until he gets his piece of it. And so that's one component on that. So that all this land, that if you were a tenant that is essentially as a lease on this land, you would owe something to this person. But I think the other context is in the first century, relatively little land would have actually been free for individualized ownership, like sort of farmer ownership, because much of the land would be owned by cities. which there was an element of that in the story, particularly of the Syrophoenician woman and her relationship to food and Jews' relationship to food that comes out subtly in that story. And here's an element, it relates back to here. So Gentile cities, large estates, Jewish elites, Romans would own large portions of land. And so even though in scripture and other references, they might describe someone as farming, they're not farming land they owned in almost every case. At the same time, within this context, there's the taxation burden is enormous.
Absolutely.
So, Herod the Great is going through all of these enormous renovations in ancient Israel. The temple is one of those, which is a context of this, particularly when Jesus is talking about stones. He would confiscate land from enemies. And he would turn these things into royal estates or convert them into monetary value in order to building projects, Caesarea Maritima by the sea, his enormous, the Herodian, his enormous castle, this amazing, really, and many of them were to the benefit of everyone, certainly in the case of the temple, but it was enormous taxation burden. But so if you want to put percentages on it, here's where we get percentages. And I think this is really eye-opening. So, peasants paid religious and civil taxes that ranged anywhere between 35 and 50%. All right. For those who raise grain, as much as 1/3 of the seed, so 1/3 of the seed from everything you planted would need to be kept for next year for planting. So you're already losing a degree of your crop just to make sure that you can grow a crop next year. And an additional 1/4 of that would be used to feed livestock. So which means after all of your taxes, after saving of the grain, after feeding it to livestock, after sending the portion to the person that actually owns the land, you would maybe have 20% left. Wow. And there's another economic thing that's happening here is it is more beneficial for someone to own a land to have fewer lessees as opposed to more. Because if a father died and had 4 sons, it is not to that owner's benefit to allow those 4 sons to co-equally do that land because it changes the margins for things.
Gotcha.
And so there's this, I think to me, it gives this sense of enormous economic pressure placed from the top, but also, to be frank, from the system that's just choking the lifeblood out of people, that makes people feel like every season is literally life or death. Because the way these agreements were written up had a terrible yield, tough cookies. You still have to give X amount. That's the nature of the lease. And so that's a context in this where I don't know how much Jesus is doing it, but he's certainly playing on the idea that I think some of the people might have even listened and thought, good for them, good for these tenants, because because this is a ridiculous system. At some point, good for these tenants to do this, but they also would have been deeply aware of instances, because they probably all would have seen it or at least heard the stories where tenants had done this and got obliterated, because that's the way it would work. And and that's the way this parable ends. And so I think that is an interesting context in all this that, again, takes an already difficult parable and only further serves to muck it up.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week I preached on the rich young ruler, which happens back in Mark 10. So we've got all of that from chapter 11 that you talked about too. But for this kind of context there, I talked about all of that taxation, like everything going on there, and talked really about how not the majority, but a lot of the parables of Jesus deal with money, deal with possessions, deal with all of these things. So in a very real way, he cared about these things. He cared about money, cared about what we do with our money, what we do, not even just money, but possessions. He cares what we do with that. So it's not that out of left field, I think, you know?
And to be fair, this has been an eye-opening thing in my studies the last probably decade is, there's no such thing as a set definition of something. So if we try to say this Greek word is defined to this, all we're saying is it was used in this manner. And so we all recognize that with language. Language is fluid. It moves around. For us, terms like righteousness take on a much more narrow meaning than it would for an ancient person. So when we read Old Testament scripture, particularly Isaiah 5 was talking about this, where God demanded righteousness out of Israel, but all God heard was cries. So in that, it's sort of paired with justice. The previous sort of doublet there is justice. And so righteousness and justice are not necessarily interchangeable terms, but they share, their overlap is enormous. And the overlap that they have that we don't have is economics. So righteousness, for the way that word would be used anciently, would be, not only was I adhering to what was required of me for purity standards, it also meant that when you and I went to the market, I didn't use separate weights to cheat you.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
It didn't, it just meant that, like, when I told you I sold you an unblemished calf, that calf was unblemished. It wasn't a goat in a calf suit. It's that type of thing. And so whereas we, in a modern sense, because we've just sort of, I think this is Greco-Roman thought, sort of where we start to disassociate physical and spiritual and economic, and particularly in America, where we very much do that, where, particularly in the church, it's just, or in Western culture, it's not always polite to talk about money, frankly. So we've disassociated those things. But for Jesus in these contexts, you're for sure right. He's discussing economics in all of these things. And he's in economics with a clearly religious tint, of course. And we will see that as Jesus talks about a widow and her mite,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So all this kind of tied together there. And that goes back. I mean, you can go back even to like the year of Jubilee. I mean, this has been all throughout the Bible. These are things that matter, and they matter like substantially.
Yes. Yeah, and at least from a prophet's voice standpoint, the responsibility of the care for the poor is always placed at the feet of the wealthy.
Absolutely.
And the wealthy and the powerful, whereas our Western culture is very much, not everyone, but certain elements of, and sadly Christian elements tend to place the responsibility for the poor, care of the poor, on themselves.
Absolutely.
And so just Jesus here is just speaking from a radically different worldview, which I imagine is, again, contributes to a story where some people may see these wicked tenets as being just, at the end, I don't know how we're supposed to interpret Jesus's words at the end, where he asks, what should the owner do? And then he says, they'll come and kill the tenants and give it to new farmers. I think one could interpret that of saying, like, that is an open-ended question that he gives one possible explanation for. And so there is still room for grace at the end. I think that's a fair interpretation, but I think it's also fair to take that, analogous meaning there and to see this as speaking of, the expansion of the gospel for the Gentiles. So it's challenging. Two quick other little things I want to talk about, which is one, for us as a Christian, we hear this and we hear him talk about sending a beloved son. And then we just jump, oh, that sounds like John 3:16. Different gospel authors, not the same agenda. They cannot be talking about the same thing. But we also hear son, and just Mark clearly understands Jesus is divine. He slow plays it more than some of the other gospel authors, but it's clear he thinks Jesus is divine. But Jesus keeps using son of man, but he's not necessarily trying to say, hey, I'm God's son, I'm God's son. And so even in the context of this, we can ascribe that to Jesus, but when Jesus says son, Jesus didn't invent this concept. The idea that, like, a son figure would be a redeemer or the one that sets things right was a common trope in ancient Near East, and particularly Judaism. You certainly see that reflected in all the patriarch narratives and things like that. So I think that's an interesting little thing to understand, because we our little dogmatic theological lenses jump on that. And I don't think that's the context. I think Jesus is just using it because it's a known rhetorical device. He's not necessarily trying to say, look, I'm the son, and yet he is saying I'm the son, if that makes sense. Yes. So he's not making a dogmatic point there. He's just making a strong point. The other piece is, and it actually has nothing to do with this parable. It happens to come right before it, which I think is fascinating. And so I want to talk about chapter 11, where it's the first part of the argument, where the Pharisees are arguing about Jesus and they're arguing about John's baptism.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jesus basically tries to make them answer the question before he answers it, to which they can't. Mm-hmm. But what I find so fascinating is particularly in, I'm going to read 30, sort of verse 30 on. It says, "Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." This is what Jesus has asked the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees turn and argue with one another and say, "What should we say? If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if they say, 'Oh, from human origin,' but shall we say of human origin, they were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet." So some commentators will point this out, and I think it's subtle there. Did you notice the first thing they go to is, if we say from heaven? Their instinct is to say John is from heaven, because
Mm-hmm.
John is a renewal movement.
Mm-hmm.
John is a holiness movement. They probably agreed with John.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an interesting insight into their minds that it's almost like, I don't know. It's almost like they want Jesus to be more John and less Jesus, because there is an element of it's not like John's movement ended
Mm-hmm.
with John's beheading. There were elements of that renewal, apocalyptic sort of parousia movement with John. And I find that interesting that there might have been, although there's absolutely no evidence of this, there might have been some disagreement among John's disciples and Jesus' disciples. And ultimately they consolidated into Jesus's
Mm-hmm.
disciples, but probably not yet. And I find that interesting that how they're held in esteem.
That is really interesting. And I wonder, and of course we're just wondering now, but I wonder how much of that, if that was something that was going on, could have been because, John's out at the river. He's calling people away into the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of things. And Jesus goes to he goes to the center, right? I mean, we're headed to Jerusalem,
Mm-hmm.
in Mark's gospel. So I wonder how much that could have come into play too. What people would have felt would have put them in conflict with Rome.
Yeah. Yeah. Phew. The last question is a question I don't have an answer for, but I like provocative questions. And one commentator I read phrased it this way, and I used a version of this in the sermon, but it's we've been given this grace. If we were to interpret this parable as we are the ones, we are now the tenants. We've received this as followers of Jesus. We've received a grace that others had previously killed for. Because the vineyard itself is the grace. To receive the vineyard is the grace. Well, other people had that. In order to keep that, they killed for it.
Mm-hmm.
And, if we're going to take this metaphor and really run with it or analyze it, what does that mean? What is that? If killing is an inappropriate response to trying to maintain this grace, or an inappropriate response or an inappropriate use of one's own choices or agency, what does that mean? It's not just violence, it's things within that. I think that's a really provocative question, that others who'd received this grace killed for it because they want it for their own or want it, whatever reasoning.
They would possess it.
Yeah, possess it. What is that? And what are the ways we're doing that? What are the ways we're killing, for this grace? I'm not sure how to answer that, but it's a question that disturbs me enough. I've been thinking about it a lot. Yep.
Which seems like a great time to turn to a recommendation.
Sure. Absolutely.
Do you have one at the ready for this week? I could go ahead and go.
I hope I don't steal one. We were talking about this earlier. We just watched the very long extended cuts of the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy with our daughter, and she's young and she's 10, but loves that sort of fantasy mythology thing, and she just ate it up and loved it. And so, if you got a good 12 hours to spend, I'd recommend just on a hot day, a hot Saturday where it's too hot to do anything, just get some loved ones, a blanket and some popcorn and just, sink into hours and hours of Tolkien. So yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
You take up a lot of your summer.
Yeah.
So mine, it will take maybe a little bit longer to explain. So a few weeks ago, Richard Sherman passed away, and he was one of the Sherman brothers, and they were both with Disney for years and years and years. So a lot of the Disney songs that we all know, the Sherman brothers actually wrote and through the parks and through movies. So like all Mary Poppins, that's them. In the parks, it's the Carousel of Progress. It's a Small World, the Tiki 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 Room. Lots of things that we know and love.
You're getting some Disney deep cuts in there. Yeah.
What? Those are very popular.
Tiki, I don't know. I have no clue what the Tiki 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 Room is.
The Tiki Room in the Magic Kingdom? Come on now.
Clue.
And Disneyland.
All right.
Anyway, so he passed away, and he and his brother, so it was Richard and Robert Sherman, and they have a show made about them, a documentary made about them on Disney Plus. It's called The Boys, the Sherman Brothers story, and it is fascinating.
Not to be confused with The Boys, the Amazon Plus show or the Amazon Prime show, which is I imagine a very different.
This is on Disney Plus.
Okay, yeah,
Disney Plus, and it's really interesting because I'll give a little bit of away. They did not get along at all. And they worked together for decades with Disney. So it was really interesting how they created all of these things that are filled with so much joy. Yeah. And yet the two of them had some conflict with each other. So it's really
Simon and Garfunkel here.
Yes. It's a really interesting story. And the last thing I would say about it is Richard Sherman was the last person alive who was allowed to play the piano in Walt's office in Disneyland.
Oh, okay.
And so it will probably never be
played again.
Never be played again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that is really interesting.
Yep.
All right. Well, folks, check those things out, and we will see you again in another week or so for another deep dive. Take care. See ya.
Bye-bye.